However, while Arendt goes no further than the madness inherent to totalitarianism, François Furet goes further. The revolutionary needs to have hateful motives. This is true for the Jacobins, but also for the Bolsheviks, and for Stalin in particular, for the latter needs to invoke, in service to his miraculous objectives, the struggle against the saboteurs, the enemies, the imperialists and their agents. 807 The French historian speaks generally of the revolutionary, but in reality he has in mind only Russia and France, and thus forgets to add that, aside from the Bolsheviks and the Jacobins, the protagonists of the Puritan Revolution are also subjected to a similar psychoanalytic approach, as well as the abolitionist revolution that does away with the institution of slavery, first in England and later in the United States. And Furet doesn't even take into account the fact that, according to an eminent American historian, the style of paranoia profoundly marked the history of his country. The belief, shared by George Washington, in London's intention to enslave the colonies on the other side of the Atlantic is a central element in the American Revolution. Later, at the end of the 18th century, when sharp contradictions arise within the new leadership group, while Jefferson ends up being suspected of being an agent of France, Hamilton is described as a British agent. A similar dialectic is evident some decades later, on the occasion of the crisis that leads to the American Civil War, when both opposing sides exchange the accusation that the other has betrayed the legacy of the Founding Fathers. 808 Not to mention the fact that, in Nietzsche's opinion, a disturbed relationship with reality characterizes the entire revolutionary tradition, beginning with those Christian agitators who are the fathers of the Church, and earlier, the Jewish prophets. Is Stalin's personality characterized by particularly accentuated traces of illness? If we start from that assumption, the admiration that leading political figures of the West had for him would be inexplicable. In any case, one fact that gives us cause for consideration: Freud, who passed away in 1939, considered it relevant to conduct a psychoanalytic study, but not of Stalin, nor even Hitler, but of Wilson, putting him on the list of those dangerous fanatics who are convinced they have a special and personal relationship with the divine, and who thereby consider themselves charged with a providential mission of guiding and transforming the world. 809 And it certainly appears a little unusual that a statesman, in taking his country into the First World War, even after witnessing the reality of the carnage, and despite being motivated by very concrete material and geopolitical interests, celebrates the American intervention as a holy war, more holy than all other wars, and celebrates the American soldiers as crusaders, protagonists of a transcendent mission. 810 But Furet concentrates on a psychopathological reading of the events that began in October 1917, and he especially concentrates on the 30 years governed by Stalin. Does he not fear, as someone who is authentically paranoid, dangers, traps and plots everywhere? What would we have to say then of F.D. Roosevelt and his subordinates who, even being able to count on a clearly more favorable political and geopolitical situation, raised the alarm about the possibility of a German invasion of America in the months before the American entry into the Second World War, and who label anti-interventionism as synonymous with national treason, warning against industrial sabotage provoked by the enemy and by a fifth column that possibly includes 500,000 people. For this reason Hitler accuses the American president of having a wild and sick imagination, the imagination of a man who's truly mentally ill. 811 As you can see, the accusation of paranoia or madness is not new. It can be thrown by the most unsuspecting people and can strike the most diverse targets. But another consideration is more important. The Bolsheviks played a strong role in the two conspiracy theories that have possibly had the greatest mark on the history of the first half of the 20th century, yet not as the protagonists but as the targets, and those theories were elaborated and propagated with a decisive contribution by the United States. In September of 1918, Wilson authorizes the publication of documents that contain sensational revelations. Not only was the October Revolution nothing more than a German conspiracy, but, even after the seizure of power, Lenin, Trotsky, and the other Bolshevik leaders continued to be at the service of Imperial Germany. There's more. The apparently dramatic internal split that happens around Brest-Litovsk had been a complete masquerade with the aim of hiding the German military's permanent control over Soviet Russia. All of this was demonstrated by the so-called Sisson Papers, taking the name of the Committee on Public Information's representative in Russia, a committee created by Wilson as part of the plans for total mobilization, including the mobilization of information. The presumed authenticity of the documents is notably supported by leading American historians who later justify themselves, making reference to the pressure put upon them in the name of necessity in times of war. 812 It's something that is also repeated outside the United States. In The Cry of the People, Gramsci quips, "Those two citizens in Russia who are named Lenin and Trotsky are impostors, fabricated in German scientific laboratories and who, made as they are by machine, can't be killed by the gunshots of terrorists." 813 Later, a second conspiracy theory arises to explain the October Revolution, but this time, aside from the usual Bolshevik suspects, it's not the Germans who are blamed, but rather the Jews. After having great resonance in the United States, the denunciation of Judeo-Bolshevik intrigues, which spread sedition throughout the world and threaten order and civilization itself, will then play a principal role in the final solution.